Welcome back. We are joined today by Professor Zhang, who uses historical patterns and game theory to predict the direction of geopolitics. And Professor Zhang is famous for many things, among some predicting the return of Trump and also the war against Iran, now a second war that is. So thank you for coming back on the program.
Thanks, Glenn.
How do you make sense of this war, though, against Iran? I mean, how do you measure how this war is developing in terms of where the successes or failures are?
Right. So first of all, Trump has failed to articulate a purpose and a strategy for this war. At first, it was about uranium enrichment in Iran. And the fear that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon. In fact, in Trump's State of the Union address, he said that he would never allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And both chambers of Congress, both the Democrats and Republicans rose to cheer and applaud. It was really the first time that Congress demonstrated any unity during that speech. It was an extremely political speech. But the problem with that is that the Omani foreign minister, a few hours before the Americans and the Israelis struck Tehran, told us that the Iranians had already agreed to zero uranium enrichment, even for civilian purposes. So the idea that Trump needs to prevent a nuclear weapon, that doesn't hold. It's just a pretext. And they tried many different excuses. And then finally, Rubio said this. Rubio basically said, look, we had to attack because Israel was going to attack first. And then the Iranians would retaliate against both the Israelis and us. So to defend ourselves, we had to preempt Israel and attack first. Okay? So they're struggling for a narrative. They're struggling to explain to the American people why this is happening. They're also struggling to contain a fallout because after the Americans and Israelis struck the Iranians started to bombard U.S. bases in the GCC, and they closed off the Strait of Hormuz. And this is doing tremendous damage to the global economy. So oil right now, it's approaching $120 a barrel, $110 a barrel. I'm not quite sure, okay? But this is double from a week ago. And remember that the Strait of Hormuz delivers most of this oil to the Asian economies of Pakistan, India, China, South Korea, and Japan. Japan relies on 75% of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz. So in about 7-8 months, Prime Minister Takahashi has informed her cabinet that Japan will be out of oil. And Japan is, a manufacturing powerhouse. So this war, it has been a disaster. And even today, Trump has failed to articulate why the Americans are doing this, what the purpose is, and what the off-ramp is. And what we're seeing day by day is pretty rapid escalation. In fact, I think the second day or the third day into this war, there were rumors of ground troops. Yesterday, there's rumors that the 82nd Airborne Division of the American Army was given deployment orders, meaning it is possible Americans will choose to airdrop these soldiers into the middle of Iran. For what purpose, we don't know. There's talk of the Americans seizing Karg Island, which is the oil depot of Iran, and which accounts for 90% of Iranian oil exports. There's talk of the Americans funding proxies. There's talk of using tactical and nuclear weapons. There's talk of a national draft to find 500,000 soldiers for a ground invasion of Iran. So this war is completely out of control. And it's completely unclear what the Americans hope to accomplish with this war.
Yeah, the narrative, I think, was very poorly planned, even worse than the war has been planned, because it began, as you said, with nuclear weapons, then moved over to ballistic missiles. Then, as apparently they wanted to help protesters, then they was about the oil, that they should be taken out of the hands of Iranians. Then Trump mentioned Iran might take over the Middle East unless, so we had to go in. And as you said, the Israel thing was interesting because if the argument is that Israel will attack Iran, then Iran will retaliate against Israel. Now, I guess Israel and the United States, so they had to go in first. And they're essentially admitting that they're fighting Israel's war, but they can't say that either. So the ability to find a narrative was kind of poor compared to other wars. Other usually have one narrative, all the media, they organize around it, and everyone obediently repeats the same talking points. It hasn't been done well. But this is a war of attrition, though, to a large extent. That is, both sides seeking, well, not both, there's all sides seeking to exhaust each other. But this is in terms of weapons, ammunition, but it's also spilling into energy and water, if you will, or just general economics. How do you see who would exhaust whom first?
Right, so I think Iran is trying to fight a war of attrition, where it is putting pressure on the global economy, on the GCC nations, because Iran believes that the GCC nations, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, can apply pressure on Trump to end this war as quickly as possible. By closing on the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is trying to pressure the Southeast Asian economies of China, Japan, and South Korea to apply pressure on Trump to end this war as soon as possible. So the Iranians are fighting a war of attrition. Unfortunately, the Americans are fighting a war of destruction. So even though they haven't stated the purpose, it is clear from what is happening on the ground that the Americans and the Israelis are intent on complete and utter destruction of the Iranian government's capacity to deliver basic services to its people. What I mean by that is that they yesterday struck a desalination plant in Iran, so you're denying fresh water to the civilian population. That is a war crime. Then the Americans struck oil facilities in Tehran. These are civilian oil facilities so that citizens in Tehran can drive their cars. And if you look at footage from Tehran, it is the apocalypse. There's acid rain. The entire sky is black, and these people have to breathe that air, so they will develop cancer. They'll have birth defects. It's almost like chemical warfare. So if you are just saying this is a war of attrition, that makes no sense. A war of attrition means when you embargo Iran economically. Why are you targeting civilians? On the first of the war, a Tomahawk missile hit a school in southern Iran and killed about 170 schoolgirls. This is an elementary school. 170 schoolgirls were killed in that. This war, the way it's being constructed, the way it's being fought, seems to me that the Americans are first and foremost focused on the destruction of Iran as opposed to regime change.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good description of that. Iran is fighting a war of attrition, so time won't be on their side while the US is, seeking to destroy the country with its 90 million people inside. So this is quite problematic. But the Iranians, of course, it's limited what they can do to the United States. They can, of course, hit their bases, and but it seems that Iran is obviously prioritizing going after the Gulf states because that's a good way of creating some pain for the US-led alliance. How vulnerable do you see them being here, though?
Yeah, so the Gulf states are the great vulnerability of the American empire because Israel, it has an eschatology. Unfortunately, religious zealots have taken over the state of Israel. So they're perfectly okay to die for what they believe in. And they can live in bomb shelters for years and years. That's how strong their faith is. And Israel was designed as an extremely resilient, extremely creative society. So Israel will emerge from this war intact and probably even stronger. But the Gulf states are different. The Gulf states are basically mirages. 50 years ago, these were just deserts, right? And for most of human history, the Arabian Peninsula was not that inhabited because it didn't have access to fresh water. It didn't have much agricultural output, and so it cannot sustain a large population. And most were desert nomads engaged in trade. But Pax Americana changed all that because Pax Americana could needed oil to fund its empire, and it could offer protection to the Gulf states. So they developed really rapidly. So cities with maybe tens of thousands of people before now are in the millions. And one striking example is Dubai. You go to Dubai, it's just skyscraper after skyscraper. It is a very glitzy city, and it's trying to be the financial capital of the Middle East. And there are thousands of extremely wealthy individuals who've transferred their savings to Dubai because they believe that it's safe, it's comfortable, lots of good Michelin restaurants, lots of good five-star hotels, and I'm not taxed. But this image of Dubai as a financial hub is now shattered by this war, and they'll never recover from this. In fact, we're already hearing rumors of millionaires just fleeing with their wealth. Now they're going to Singapore. Now they're going to Southeast Asia. A bigger problem is this. A bigger problem is that because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, their oil economies have collapsed. They can no longer sell their oil, and they shut down their oil production facilities. What people don't recognize is that the Strait of Hormuz takes GCC oil to Asia, but then it brings back food. The GCC imports 80 to 90% of its food supply. So the rumor is Dubai will run out of food in about a week's time. Then there's the issue of fresh water, where the greatest vulnerability is actually desalination plants. So the GCC nations, desalination plants provide about 60% of all their water needs. And so if these desalination plants are destroyed, then they run out of water in 1 or 2 weeks. And this means the entire destruction of the GCC. Now, I mean, destroying desalination plants will be the nuclear option for Iran. And so I don't think they would use it very lightly. But there's really no coming back from what's happening. I mean, for the longest time, the GCC had a reputation for being safe, for being extremely wealthy. And now that mirage, that illusion has been shattered. And once the illusion is shattered, you can't ever resurrect it again.
No, I very much agree. The Gulf states are not just dependent on energy, but the finance, the real estate market, which is propped up by all the expats. But what you're also describing, though, is these small monarchies selling their oils in dollar, and the U.S. in return offering protection. This was also the petrodollar system that replaced Bretton Woods once they closed the gold window. So what do you see being the possible consequences for the global economy?
Right. So what Iran wants to do is basically kick the U.S. out of the Middle East for a lot of reasons. And the main advantage is that once the U.S. leaves, Iran will be able to control the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, it will control trade access for the entire world. And that, and so the Gulf states will basically become client states of the Iranians rather than Americans. And that oil money now will be able to finance the rebuilding of Iran. So that's the end goal or the end game for the Iranians. The problem with empire is the hubris. And so another way of saying this is the empire would rather destroy the world than surrender its power, right? So the idea that the Americans will just leave the Middle East peacefully is just wishful thinking. Everyone's saying that, this war can only lead to the defeat of America. So America should just admit defeat right now and then go home and let Israel and Iran settle whatever problems that they have. Like the Middle East is not America's problem. But again, the problem is that America is addicted to the petrodollar. Leaving the Middle East would destroy the petrodollar. And if the petrodollar is destroyed, it would collapse the American economy as well. So America has $40 trillion in debt. And this debt is a Ponzi scheme. Like the American economy is sustained by a Ponzi scheme. And so the Gulf states, what they do is they sell their oil, get petrodollars, and then they recycle it back into the American economy, mainly by investing into AI, into data centers, which is now the main engine of growth for the American economy. So the Gulf states were to stop investing in America, the AI financial bubble would burst, and with it, the entire American economy. America would suffer a much greater depression than the 1930s. That's how dire the situation is for America right now.
But the United States, though, they must have known that this would be a disaster. I mean, many of the top military people in the United States warned in advance that they would have limited weapons. They would have a limited ability to go on for too long, which of course could explain why they're instead going for burning down Iran if they can't, if time is essentially on Iran's side. But there's been war games in the past where they showed that they couldn't pull this off. I mean, you had God knows how many American presidents who wanted to attack Iran, but they always knew that yeah, that's not a good idea. So how do you make sense of this? Because that was my one, when they were building up to this war, sending more and more military hardware to the region. My main reason for thinking this might not happen was it would simply be too crazy. The likelihood of success, the amount of things that could go wrong. I mean, it just indicated that they can't possibly go down this path. So why? I guess why did they? They do have informed people in the United States. We know. So how do you make sense of this?
Right. So again, I agree with you in that this war doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. And everyone knows that America was going to lose this war. The problem is that when empires are in decline, this is just the way they behave. And there's just the historical record, it's pretty overwhelming in that when empires decline, they lash out against the world. They start these stupid wars they can't possibly win. They overextend themselves, and the collapse is terrible for the world. And America very much is an empire in decline. Look at things such as the collapse of the family. Look at things such as the collapse of the currency. Currency debasement in America is just a tremendous problem. The US dollar is no longer worth as much as it was like 10 years ago. The political polarization in America. Congress just cannot function properly. The president has so much power nowadays because Congress has basically decided to just not do anything to avoid any political responsibility. And so it's destroying the checks and balance systems of the US Constitution. The economic depression in America is great. Young people feel as though there's absolutely no hope in the world. They're refusing to have families. They're refusing to invest in the future. They gamble all the time. And so America is really the end of empire at this point. And so what they do is they go and start wars in order to distract people's attentions, in order to prove to the world that they still have it. They're still the bully in the playground, and they can still beat up every other kid, even though they're old and they're weak and they're handicapped. And so, we talk about Iran, but look at what was happening before Iran, right? Trump kidnapped the president of Venezuela, which went against international law. Trump deployed his navy in the Caribbean and started to bomb drug boats, which is again against international law. Trump was threatening to annex Greenland. He was threatening to invade Canada. He was threatening to attack Mexico. Right now, he's embargoing Cuba, and people don't even recognize this is happening because there's so much going on in the world. But Cuba was dependent on Venezuela oil. That was its energy supply. And now that Venezuela has fallen to the Americans have embargoed Cuba. And so now people don't have access to electricity. And there are actually people who are starving in Cuba. So this is an empire in decline. It just lashes out against the world. It attacks everyone. And Iran is just the most current iteration of this anger and this hubris. But this hubris made the Americans underestimate the capacity of Iran. They went in thinking that once they decapitate the regime, then the government would fall. And what the Americans didn't recognize was the resilience and the resolve of the Iranian people.
Well, about this imperial decline, it reminds me of something that Emmanuel Todd, the French scholar, argued, because, well, again, he predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union already in the 70s by looking at these different social variables. But he also predicted the US empire was heading towards, well, a similar fate already in the early 2000s. And he described essentially what you did, this strange, he called it micro-militarism, this brutal use of military force in an effort to show power when it's obviously draining. So it is an interesting development. But you mentioned that the Americans are losing as if it's a given. Why do you assess this? Is this mainly the focus on the military hardware at their disposal, or is it the lack of a clear objective? Well, I guess regime change will be very hard without the ground troops.
Right. So America right now has several disadvantages. The first major disadvantage is the lack of political will. And that just means the lack of a strategy, the lack of a purpose. It cannot unify the American people in order to make the sacrifice necessary to win this war. In fact, most Americans are against this war. Right before the war started, 70 to 80% of Americans voiced their disapproval of a possible war with Iran. Usually when a war starts, people will rally behind the flag, but not in this case. Most Americans are still against the war. So the first issue is the lack of political will. But if you look at the Iranians, they believe that this is a struggle of life and death. So they set aside the political differences and they've committed to winning this war. Okay, so that's the first factor, political will. The second factor is just manufacturing capacity. So these past 30, 40 years, America went from a manufacturing-based economy to a financial-based economy, and they export their manufacturing capacity to China. Now, when you fight a war, what really matters is your capacity to produce ammunition, to replenish your munitions, logistics. And America doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to fight a long war. In fact, what's happening already is that America is cannibalizing munitions from other parts of the world. So they are now transferring munitions from South Korea over to the Middle East, which is stupid to do because now you've basically opened more flanks, opened more vulnerabilities throughout the world. So manufacturing capacity is a very important factor. On the other hand, Iran uses drones and ballistic missiles. And we know that Iran is able to manufacture about 500 drones a day. And quite honestly, you only need to have 10 drones hit their targets in the Middle East every single day in order for the GCC to cry uncle, right? So manufacturing capacity is a very important factor as well. And the third factor is that America is hamstringed by a lot of political considerations. So because they lack political will, they do not want to take too many casualties, right? So Trump has said that 6 Americans have died in this war so far. There's just absolutely no way this is true. We are hearing rumors that there are a lot of casualties being flown to Germany to try to disguise the fact that in the Middle East, many Americans are dying. But this tells us that America has absolutely no appetite to sustain any casualties. If you refuse to have any casualties, how are you going to fight a war, right? On the other hand, the Iranians are very eschatological. They are very religious. They are Shia Muslim, and they're not afraid to die. In fact, they believe it is the highest honor to martyr yourself for the higher good. And the clear example of this is the Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed in the first day of strikes. And, he could have gone to Moscow and he could have hid his bunker, but instead he chose to go to his office and carry on with his life because he's 86 years old and he does not want to die afraid of the Americans. And so he set the example that is galvanizing the Iranian people. If you just look at some social media footage from Iran, the Iranian people are now extremely energetic, extremely galvanized, and they will fight this war to the bitter end.
Yeah, no, I was in Tehran last year, and I was also a bit. Well, that's one thing that really stood out: the culture of martyrdom, the way they would put the martyrs' pictures on the walls at many places. This is an important variable beyond the material variables if you want to assess how a country would actually fight. And the whole idea of killing Khamenei and now everything will fall into place. I mean, his son has taken over now, and it has to be pointed out that the Americans killed his father, his mother, they killed his wife, they killed his sister, and they killed his son. I mean, the idea, as Trump said, well, we will pick the next guy, and he will have to be acceptable to us. He has to be more favorable to America and accommodating and more moderate. It doesn't make any sense. How can you burn down the country and again, just if you look at the new leader, slaughter his whole family and then assume that they will just fall in line. If you look at the culture in Iran, the martyrdom culture, which is strong, you can say among Shiites in general, this was always crazy, but for somehow this seemed to have been the assumption. But how do you see though the possibility of this war spreading? Because they're attacking U.S. bases, which covers a lot of country. So you have U.S. proxies being used, such as Kurds, which could then trigger a civil war in a country of 90 million people. There's now, the American and British media especially, they're all up in arms that Russia is giving intelligence to Iran to try to, make Trump push harder against Russia in Ukraine, even though this, is also a dangerous path. I'm not sure to what extent China would get involved. I mean, do you see a pathway here from it becoming a proper regional war or a world war? How do you see this?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's an off-ramp for this war. I think it's very hard to de-escalate. The idea that the Americans will just give up their petrodollar and their American bases and just go home is just absurd. That is not how empires behave. Also, Israel, because it wants to achieve the Greater Israel Project, is heavily invested in creating a regional conflagration to create as much havoc as possible so that they could destroy the region and then be the only one left standing. Okay, and so what Israel wants to do is drag everyone into the war, including Turkey, including Saudi Arabia, including basically the entire Middle East. And so during the first couple of days, there was reporting that an Iranian drone had struck a Saudi Aramco oil facility. And so Aramco closed down all its energy production. But then later reporting came out to reveal that actually the drone came from Lebanon. So it didn't come from the east, it came from the west, which meant Israel. Tucker Carlson on his TV show, on his show, said that he had received information from the Qataris that they had arrested 2 Mossad agents. And they suspected these Mossad agents of trying to sabotage the Qatar oil facilities in order to create a false flag. So the Israelis are heavily invested in trying to create as much conflict between the GCC and Iran as possible. And now there's talk of Turkey coming in as well. Recently, there was a drone attack from Iran against Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan was very angry about this and even floated the possibility of sending in ground troops against Iran. But then it was later discovered that this was probably a false flag of the Israelis. So the Israelis are heavily interested in spreading this war as far as possible and creating as much destruction as possible. And they want this war to continue for as long as possible because they have nuclear weapons. So the Iranians are not going to hit them too hard. The Iranians are going to hit the GCC much harder. And so it's just, for the Israelis, they just have to endure, right? It's a war of attrition. And then once Saudi Arabia is destroyed, once the GCC is destroyed, then Israel will be the only power left standing. Okay, so that is Israel's intention. Other nations will eventually have to be drawn in as well. So one wild card is Pakistan. So during the 12th Day War, Pakistan supported Iran. But after that, a few months after that, Saudi Arabia signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan. So if Saudi Arabia is attacked, Pakistan must come to its aid. And we know that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So it is very likely that at some point, Saudi Arabia will join this war on behalf of the Americans. Because the animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran go way back. Iran is a theocracy. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. And they see each other as heretical, okay, as against Islam. The Iranians hate Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is the home of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in the Islamic world. At the same time, they host a lot of American soldiers. These are infidels in the eyes of the Iranians. And so the Iranians are heavily interested in trying to topple the Saudi regime. And they're going to apply pressure to cause uprisings throughout the GCC. And I believe that at some point, the Saudi government will decide to enter this war. And if they enter this war, then Pakistan is obligated to enter this war as well. If the Americans were to launch a ground invasion, it would make sense to attack from multiple vectors. And one vector would be from Pakistan. Another vector, of course, would be from Iraq. The last vector would be from Azerbaijan. They would also try to seize the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible in order to maintain global trade. So that in the short term, we can expect the entire Middle East to be engulfed in this war at some point. In the long term, eventually, the Southeast Asian economies will have to intervene. So South Korea and Japan are extremely reliant on oil from the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, they would basically starve to death if it were not from this oil from the Strait of Hormuz. But there's a wild card, and that's North Korea. So if you're North Korea and you are analyzing the situation, you recognize that now's the perfect opportunity to threaten South Korea because the Americans are distracted in the Middle East, and the South Koreans don't have access to the oil they need to protect themselves against the North Koreans. So just threaten South Korea, and then the Americans are forced to divert their attention back to Southeast Asia, and Japan is forced to come into this conflict as well. And the North Koreans aren't doing this to start a war. That would be suicidal. They're doing this to extort as much as possible from South Korea and Japan. And so I expect that to happen as well. The Western Hemisphere will not be quiet this time because while this is happening, Trump is still intent on toppling the Cuban government, okay? So it's possible 2 weeks from now, while this war is still raging, Trump attacks Cuba or Mexico or Colombia. It is complete insanity. But this is, again, unfortunately, this is the way an empire behaves as it declines.
Well, what does this mean for the wider world order? Because this idea of the international distribution being focused around U.S. global primacy, legitimized then by liberal democratic values, this world order, the post-Cold War world order of the liberal hegemony, is gone. So the U.S. is not dominant anymore, and liberal democratic values, I mean, no one really thinks this is what the Western powers are, that these are their objectives in foreign policy. It's a thin veil which has been tossed away. So what is the new world order then, from your perspective, or what will follow this?
Right. So there will be 3 major trends that follow from this, okay? The first major trend is deindustrialization, because you don't have access to cheap energy. So you need to make your economy much more balanced. Before, we had the growth of urban centers, which engage in the knowledge economy, which engage in AI, in EV, in solar panels, right? But all of that requires access to cheap energy, which is what the Middle East provided. But now that the Middle East is going to be destroyed or be engulfed in war for the next 10, 20 years, you have to deindustrialize. You have to focus more on self-sufficiency, okay? So that's the first trend, deindustrialization. Second major trend is mercantilism, okay? And what I mean by that is that the global order is dead. And so what you need to do is basically focus on local trade or creating your own supply networks, spheres of influence, okay? And the third major trend, which is the most troubling, is remilitarization. Because Pax Americana is dead, and Pax Judaica is not interested in protecting you from big bad bullies, okay? So it's either you rearm as soon as possible and defend yourself, or you'll be eaten alive by a wolf, right? So I think in East Asia, the first nation to recognize the changing world order, because it has no choice in the matter, is Japan. I think that they brought in Prime Minister Takaichi because she appealed to the young, and she has the charisma to galvanize the young to make the sacrifices necessary in order to deindustrialize, remilitarize, and create a self-sufficient economic system. So I think that Japan will actually suffer in the beginning, but they will actually be in the forefront of global change. And nations that absolutely refuse to make these three necessary changes will be the most likely to suffer. And quite honestly, I have very little hope for my own country, which is China. I think that because of these changes, Japan will start to emerge as the local hegemon, while China is still stuck to the old global order. But in the short term, what this means is that the United States and China will have a rapprochement, okay? So even though this war has started, Trump will still visit Beijing March 31st, at the end of this month, for a 3-day state visit. And I think that people will be surprised by how friendly and productive this meeting will be. And in fact, actually this year, there are scheduled 3 major summits between China and the United States. And so I think that both nations are working towards a rapprochement in order to repair the global order. But there's no saving the global order. It's dying. And so if you omit this reality and commit to revamping society, deindustrialization, remilitarization, and moving towards a self-sufficient economy, then you are much more likely to weather the storm that is coming.
You say that China's stuck in the old world order, and one can see why. Well, with 40 years of unprecedented prosperity and growth in human history, one can see why one would want to, at all costs, keep this world going, even though it already went away. It's not that unlike the Europeans, though, because then the 90s, was a rebirth of Europe, or thought together with the US was the center of the world. I remember having books at university which were with the title "Why the 21st Century Belongs to Europe." I mean, this was kind of the mentality. I thought that was also always a bit ridiculous, but anyways, there was reason for optimism, it seemed. So that's why they also cling on to a world order which is dying, which is why they're not able to adjust to the new world. One place, though, where there's a lot of pressure to readjust to the new order is Russia. That is, the spokesperson Peskov. He made a comment now recently saying that we have lost we have all lost what we call international law. So the system is essentially dying, if not dead. And I think what really shook them was the decapitation strike on Iran, because this is, the desperate act of a dying empire. And why wouldn't they do the same towards Russia? Indeed, they've been attacking their nuclear deterrent very openly, I would say. I think this is likely that they tried to assassinate Putin at Valdai with this attack, at least, is a theory. And again, why wouldn't they go for a decapitation strike against Russia? This is what many are thinking. Look what they done to Iran. There's no rules. So why then is Russia doing this slow war of attrition? And also, they did this at the expense of their deterrent. That is, they allowed the Americans and the Europeans to openly, launch missiles deep into Russia. You can have a German chancellor sitting on stage saying, "Oh yes, we imposed untold casualties on the Russians." I mean, there's so much pressure now on the Kremlin to drop this, whatever they've done the past 4 years, and why not do like the Iranians? Time to, bring some pain to the Europeans, because the Europeans for the past 4 years said, why should the war be limited to Ukraine? Why not also extend it to Russia? Well, why shouldn't the Russians bring it to Europe? This is what I see as the direction, which is, terrifying, because this is a recipe for a much larger war. I was wondering how do you see this, the Russian component here, because they're also one of the great powers.
Right. So I personally think that of all the world leaders, Vladimir Putin is the only one with a grand strategy. He's a very capable leader, and he sees the big picture. He plays chess. And so what he's waiting for is a U.S. ground invasion of Iran. That's what he's waiting for. Because once the United States sends in ground troops, then the United States is all in. It can't extricate itself from the situation. And at any point, the United States can stop this air campaign and say, you know what? We killed the Ayatollah. We destroyed the Iranian nuclear threat. So we're going to go home, guys. Goodbye, okay? But once the United States sends in ground troops, then it's locked in to this Iranian quagmire for 5 to 10 years. And there's no escaping. It'll be like another Vietnam, right? This gives Putin and Russia the perfect opportunity to move towards Odessa, which is the real goal and the end goal of this war in Ukraine. Because once they have Odessa, then they have basically achieved all their major military objectives. And so what's going to happen is the Europeans will have no choice but to defend Odessa to the last European. And that's where the next major conflict will be, the siege of Odessa. And if the siege of Odessa were to happen, the Europeans would exhaust themselves defending against the Russian attack. The Russians have perfected drone artillery warfare in the trenches of Ukraine, and that's a perfect combination if you are to besiege Odessa. And so the Europeans, they may be fresh, but they will be inexperienced. And so they will make a lot of mistakes. They will lose a lot of casualties. And this war will eventually become so unpopular back in Europe that the population would revolt against the governments, okay? So remember, this is a time of nuclear war, so you can't actually destroy each other's military. But what you can do is put so much stress and pain on the political system that the citizens ultimately rebel and overthrow the political system and impose a new system that is much more friendly towards Russia. So that, I think, is the grand plan that Putin has, and it's going to work.
Well, I think it's the Chinese who say we live in interesting times. So thank you very much. Huh?
It's much too interesting.
Well, thank you for taking the time. And yeah, it's as you began saying, this war against Iran, it's hard to believe that they went through with this, given all the risks. But this is, I always make the point, this is going to be the greatest catastrophe, is this illusion of escalation control, the assumption that they can control all the variables, decide how it ends, who's allowed to participate, how they contribute. I mean, this is really the same as with the Russians in Ukraine. This assumption of escalation control, this is what's going to kill us effectively, though.
Well, I will say this. I made this prediction 2 years ago. The United States would invade Iran. I've been saying for 2 years consistently that this would happen. The moment that it happened, I was shocked and bewildered, and I couldn't sleep because I was like, why would they do this? So yeah, I mean, I sympathize with what you're feeling.
播报新闻是我的日常，必须时刻保持妆容和皮肤的最佳状态。当来到人生中最重要的时刻，也是 KS 逆时奇迹帮助我轻松驾驭，闪闪发光。KS 逆时奇迹活肤露全效精华、精华霜，多达5种 EGF 6大冻龄关键成分，保湿效果让我非常满意，小细纹也不再困扰我。我就是我自己的最佳女主角 ，KS 让我从容自信，光彩动人。我是我人生中的大女主，我的最爱我做主。KS 逆时奇迹系列热卖中，下单请上快点购。透过中天新闻网 App 下单立减50%，或输入 CTI 推荐码有额外折扣。